The 1970s were supposed to be a golden age of Saturday morning fun, but what if I told you some animated films from that decade left parents stunned, outraged, or completely confused? These weren't the safe Disney reruns you think of. These were bold, bizarre, sometimes brilliant experiments that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. Why did they disappear? Bad timing, shocking content, or just plain weirdness? Stick around because some of these lost gems will blow your mind. Shinbone Alley, 1970. Imagine taking your kid to a colorful cartoon and realizing halfway through that the lead character is a cockroach in love. That was Shinbone Alley, a 1970 animated feature adapted from Don Marquis' newspaper poems about Archie the cockroach and Mehitabel the alley cat. On paper, it sounded quirky, even literary. On screen, it was pure nightmare fuel for unsuspecting parents. The movie starts with Archie, a depressed poet reincarnated as a cockroach, trying to woo Mehitabel, a streetwise cat voiced by Carol Channing. Parents expecting lighthearted animal antics instead got heavy doses of existential dread, infidelity jokes, and songs dripping with innuendo. The roach laments life's futility. The cat sings about her many boyfriends. And the whole thing plays out like a grimy cabaret set to jazz. Not exactly popcorn fare for a 6-year-old. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of it. Some praised the oddball animation style and sophisticated dialogue. Others called it a cartoon for no one, too adult for kids, too cartoony for adults. Box office numbers agreed. The film flopped so hard that the studio barely promoted it after opening week. Prints were pulled, and by the mid-70s, it was already fading from circulation. What makes Shinbone Alley fascinating now is its ambition. It wasn't afraid to deal with themes of failure, loneliness, and survival on society's margins. But parents leaving the theater in 1970 weren't interested in philosophy. They wanted Bugs Bunny, not Kafka with whiskers. Today, Shinbone Alley is nearly impossible to find outside of collector circles. It stands as a weird, forgotten experiment, proof that the 70s could serve up cartoons that weren't kid-friendly at all. Heavy Traffic, 1973. If you thought a talking cockroach was weird, wait until you hear about Heavy Traffic, Ralph Bakshi's gritty 1973 follow-up to Fritz the Cat. Parents who walked in expecting a funky cartoon comedy walked out looking like they'd seen a war documentary. The movie follows Michael, a young underground cartoonist navigating New York City's decaying streets. It's an animated fever dream packed with bar fights, hustlers, racial clashes, and surreal fantasy sequences. Bakshi blended live action with animation, graffiti-style drawings with rotoscoped realism. Nothing looked like it before, and honestly, nothing has since. The shock came from its raw honesty. Characters curse, fight, bleed, and spiral through violence and betrayal. One moment you're laughing at a slapstick gag, the next you're staring at a scene so bleak it feels ripped from a police blotter. Parents dragged their kids out of screenings, furious that theaters had marketed it as cartoon entertainment. They weren't wrong. The marketing was vague enough that families stumbled into something closer to Taxi Driver than Looney Tunes. Critics were split. Some hailed it as groundbreaking art, a brutal snapshot of urban decay. Others dismissed it as offensive trash that hid behind animation to push boundaries no live-action studio would dare touch. Bakshi himself insisted he was just holding a mirror to reality. But in 1973, many parents wanted cartoons to offer escape, not confrontation. The film had a limited run, then quietly disappeared from most theaters. Some prints survived, but by the 80s it was already slipping into obscurity, remembered mostly by cult animation fans. For parents in the 70s, though, Heavy Traffic was a wake-up call. Cartoons weren't just for kids anymore, and sometimes they hit harder than live-action ever could. Tubby the Tuba, 1975. Picture this. You take your kids to see a cheerful little film about a tuba who dreams of playing melodies instead of background notes. Sounds wholesome, right? That was the promise of Tubby the Tuba when it resurfaced in 1975. Parents thought they were in for a safe musical cartoon. What they got instead was an awkward relic that felt more confusing than charming. The film wasn't new, It was originally made in 1971, based on a children's record from the 1940s. By the time it finally reached theaters in the mid-70s, it looked outdated. The animation was clunky, the story dragged, and the songs were far from catchy. Kids were restless, parents were bored, and critics were merciless. One review bluntly called it a tuba full of hot air. But the real surprise came from the tone. Instead of light-hearted music fun, Tubby's journey was oddly heavy. He's bullied, mocked, and humiliated for most of the story. The uplifting message about self-acceptance comes so late that kids had already tuned out. Parents expecting a jolly sing-along instead found themselves watching a strangely melancholy cartoon about rejection. The film flopped instantly. Distribution was so small that many theaters pulled it after just a week. Prints vanished into storage, and when the VHS boom hit in the 80s, Tubby was nowhere to be found. Today, surviving copies are rare, making it one of the strangest lost cartoons of the era. For parents in the 70s, Tubby the Tuba was a lesson. Not every animated film with a smiley poster was actually worth sitting through. Sometimes, even the safest-looking cartoon could turn into a slog that left kids squirming and parents regretting the ticket price. Coonskin Street Fight, 1975. If Ralph Bakshi shook parents with heavy traffic, his next project, Coonskin, set the house on fire. Released in 1975 under the title Street Fight, it was meant to be a satirical mix of animation and live action. Instead, it became one of the most controversial animated films of the decade, a movie that parents stumbled into expecting edgy humor, only to find themselves in the middle of a cultural battlefield. The film follows Brother Rabbit, Brother Bear, and Preacher Fox, trickster figures navigating a gritty urban landscape filled with crime bosses, hustlers, and corrupt cops. It was meant as biting satire, but the delivery was so raw, so exaggerated, that many viewers didn't know whether to laugh or be horrified. The animation was surreal, bouncing between caricature and nightmare imagery. Parents already skeptical of Bakshi after heavy traffic were stunned. Community protests erupted, screenings were shut down. Even theaters that dared to show it were met with picket lines. To parents who accidentally brought their children, it was a disaster. This wasn't Bugs Bunny. This was sharp-edged social commentary mixed with chaos. The film barely saw a release, and many prints were pulled or destroyed. Over time, it became a ghost, whispered about among cult fans, but rarely seen in full. Some praised it as genius, others condemned it as offensive, but everyone agreed. It wasn't a cartoon you could take your kids to. For parents in the 70s, Coonskin was a shocking reminder that animation could be as explosive and divisive as any live-action film. It was proof that a cartoon could be the most dangerous thing playing in town. Once Upon a Girl, 1976. Fairy tales. Safe, charming, moral little stories to tuck your kids in with, right? Wrong. In 1976, an animated anthology called Once Upon a Girl hit a handful of theaters, and parents who bought tickets for what they thought was a family-friendly film were in for a jaw-dropping surprise. The film set itself up like a standard storybook collection, classic tales like Jack and the Beanstalk, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty. But instead of innocent adventures, the stories were twisted into bizarre parodies, loaded with adult jokes and exaggerated slapstick that veered way off the rails. Parents brought their children expecting the usual magical kingdoms and left shaking their heads, wondering how it ever made it onto a marquee. The problem wasn't just the humor, it was the tone. Characters behaved with cynicism, sarcasm, and snark that clashed with the cheerful animation style. The stories took detours into gags that left kids puzzled and parents unamused. One critic wrote that the film looks like a cartoon, sounds like a cartoon, but plays like a prank on the audience. Distribution was a mess. Some theaters marketed it like a family feature, others quietly slid it into late-night showings. The confusion only added to the reputation. By the end of its short run, the film had already earned a reputation as the fairy tale movie that blindsided parents the hardest. Today, Once Upon a Girl is barely remembered, with prints rumored to survive only in private collections. But for the unlucky parents of 1976, it was unforgettable, a classic case of mistaken expectations, when a harmless-looking cartoon turned out to be anything but. Wizards 1977. When parents in 1977 saw an animated fantasy called Wizards, many thought they were taking their kids to a safe alternative to Disney's The Rescuers. Instead, they walked into Ralph Bakshi's trippy, post-apocalyptic fever dream that featured mutants, elves, and, believe it or not, Nazis. The film opens on a scorched earth, thousands of years after nuclear war has wiped out most of humanity. Out of the ashes rise two wizards, the kindly Avatar and his evil brother, Black Wolf. Sounds like a typical good versus evil story, right? But then Bakshi layers in psychedelic visuals, rotoscoped battle footage lifted straight from old World War II reels, and dialogue about propaganda, genocide, and nuclear annihilation. Parents were stunned. Their kids weren't just watching a cartoon, they were watching an allegory for humanity's darkest moments. The strangest part? The film wasn't rated harshly. It carried a PG, which fooled families into thinking it was safe. But no Disney movie ever cut to stock footage of Hitler giving a speech. No Saturday morning cartoon ever showed mushroom clouds and armies of mutants marching under swastika banners. Some parents walked out mid-screening, dragging their kids with them. Critics were divided. Some hailed Wizards as visionary, a daring mix of adult themes with fantasy animation. Others wrote it off as incoherent, even irresponsible. The split reaction only added to the cult aura around it. Over time, Wizards became a midnight movie staple, but in the late 70s, it was just plain confusing. Parents expecting a cheerful cartoon about magic left wondering if they'd accidentally walked into a nightmare. It was a turning point that proved animation could be as intense and political as live action. Hugo the Hippo, 1975. On the surface, Hugo the Hippo looked like harmless children's fare, a colorful Hungarian-American co-production about a baby hippo who tries to save his kind from greedy rulers. But when the U.S. release rolled out in 1975, parents realized quickly that this was no ordinary kiddie flick. The film's cast included heavy hitters like Burl Ives, Paul Lynde, and even Orson Welles as a villainous sultan. The animation was bright, surreal, and almost psychedelic, with shifting colors and dreamlike transitions. Sounds fun for kids, right? Except the story dove into politics, corruption, and animal cruelty in ways no child could grasp. Hippos are slaughtered, villagers starve, and Hugo's quest for justice plays out like an anti-establishment protest film, disguised as a cartoon. Parents were baffled. Kids cried during the darker sequences, and adults sat there wondering how a hippo movie had turned into an allegory for power abuse and moral decay. The tone shifted wildly. One moment you had cute animal antics, the next you had chilling narration from Orson Welles about greed and destruction. The American release was heavily cut, but even the edited version left audiences scratching their heads. Critics called it bewildering and a children's film that forgot about children. The studio quietly buried it after a short run, and Prince slipped into obscurity. Today, Hugo the Hippo survives mainly in fragments and grainy tapes. For 1970s parents, though, it was unforgettable, proof that even the most innocent-looking cartoon could take a sharp left turn into surreal, unsettling territory. The Mouse and His Child, 1977. If Disney taught parents to expect happy endings, The Mouse and His Child ripped that expectation to shreds. Released in 1977, this animated feature from United Artists followed two wind-up toy mice, a father and son, on a heartbreaking journey to find freedom. It sounds whimsical, but the execution was devastating. From the opening minutes, the toys are discarded, broken, and forced into a bleak world of junkyards, cruelty, and loss. The villain is a manipulative rat crime boss who enslaves toys. The comic relief comes from bleak gags about poverty and abandonment. Parents brought their kids in, hoping for a cute talking toy adventure, only to sit through a meditation on despair and survival. Critics described it as a children's film that could traumatize children. Reviewers pointed out that the tone was closer to Dickens than Disney, with characters enduring endless suffering before finding the faintest glimmer of hope. Even the animation style was muted, filled with shadows and desolate landscapes. Kids left theaters confused or upset. Parents left wondering how such a grim story got marketed as the family entertainment. Some theaters pulled it after audience complaints, and within a few years the film was virtually forgotten. Collectors today treasure The Mouse and His Child as an ambitious oddity. But in 1977, it was the definition of a parental shocker, a film that proved not all animated features were meant to leave kids smiling on the way home. Raggedy Ann and Andy, a musical adventure, 1977. In 1977, parents thought they were safe with a cartoon about Raggedy Ann and Andy. How could dolls that had been in toy chests for decades be anything but wholesome? Then they sat down for Raggedy Ann and Andy, a musical adventure, and by the time the credits rolled, many were wondering if they had just watched a fever dream. The film was directed by Richard Williams, the same genius who later animated Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And visually, it shows swirling colors, elaborate character animation, and surreal dreamscapes. But the story? That's where things went off the rails. Instead of a cheerful adventure, kids were treated to disturbing villains like the Greedy, a blob-like monster that swallows everything in sight, or the bizarre Camel With, the wrinkled knees, who looks like something drawn during a hallucination. Parents were blindsided by the tone. The songs were odd, the pacing uneven, and the sense of dread far stronger than the sense of joy. Critics described it as nightmare fuel in the form of a children's musical. Children reportedly cried in theaters, and adults whispered that it felt more like an art house experiment than a family film. Despite the lavish production and a budget that ballooned out of control, the film bombed. It was pulled quickly and never found its footing on home video. For decades, it hovered in semi-obscurity, resurfacing only among collectors. Parents of the 70s walked in, expecting gentle lessons about kindness and friendship. What they got was a surreal carnival of unsettling imagery that left everyone scratching their heads. Metamorphoses, Winds of Change, 1978. Take the timeless Greek myths, add 70s psychedelic art, and release it under the name Metamorphoses, later rebranded as Winds of Change. Sounds like a bold educational experiment, right? For parents who took their kids in 1978, it was more like watching Homer's epics on acid. The film presented animated vignettes of Ovid's tales, Apollo and Daphne, Orpheus and Eurydice, Pygmalion, and more. But instead of classical storytelling, the myths were filtered through kaleidoscopic visuals, distorted voices, and disjointed sequences that felt like animated music videos. The soundtrack pulsed with 70s soft rock and disco-inspired beats. Parents were shocked. They expected a school-friendly retelling of Greek legends. Instead, they got a psychedelic head trip. Figures morphed into abstract shapes, gods loomed like cosmic rock stars, and the tone wavered between dreamlike and downright disturbing. Kids fidgeted in their seats, confused by the surreal flow, while adults muttered that they hadn't signed up for a midnight movie. Critics panned it. Some called it a trippy mess. Others admitted it had visual ambition, but zero coherence. Distribution collapsed after a limited release, and most prints vanished. Today, only a handful of poor-quality copies survive. For parents of the 70s, Metamorphoses was a shocking bait and switch. What looked like a safe mythology lesson turned into a swirling, disorienting cartoon that was anything but classroom material. Twice Upon a Time, 1979. Imagine a cartoon produced with the backing of George Lucas and the brilliance of animation veteran John Cordy. Now, imagine it nearly being lost before anyone could see it. That's the strange story of Twice Upon a Time, an experimental animated film that confused parents and baffled distributors in 1979. The film used a rare technique called lumage, where cut-out translucent images were animated on a glowing board. The result was unlike anything seen before, glowing, collage-like visuals that looked like living storybooks. The plot followed Ragpicker and Ralph the all-purpose animal as they battled, evil forces trying to replace children's dreams with nightmares. Sounds quirky and whimsical. But the execution? Pure chaos. Dialogue rambled, gags fell flat, and the pacing was so odd that kids struggled to follow it. Parents who brought their families expecting a Lucas-approved new kind of Disney found themselves staring at surreal imagery and strange jokes that seemed to belong in a college art project, not a children's matinee. Worse, distribution fell apart almost immediately. Confusion over which cut should be released, a clean version or one with sharper, edgier jokes, meant it barely hit theaters. Many prints were shelved, and the film floated in obscurity for years. Today, cult fans praise Twice Upon a Time as daring and ahead of its time. But in 1979, it was a puzzling, nearly lost cartoon that left parents shocked, kids restless, and studios reluctant to experiment further. Animal Olympics, 1979. In the late 70s, the Olympics were everywhere, so why not make an animated parody with talking animals competing in events? That was the pitch behind Animal Olympics, a cartoon commissioned for NBC's coverage of the 1980 Summer and Winter Games. Parents expected a safe, goofy romp about lions racing and penguins skating. What they got was satire, lots of satire. The work print circulated in 1979 before its official TV release, and that's where the confusion began. Instead of family-friendly hijinks, Animal Olympics featured sly jokes about politics, media obsession, and celebrity culture. Athletes smoked, partied, and made cynical asides about fame. The humor skewed toward adults, leaving kids puzzled. Parents who previewed it were shocked. This wasn't Bugs Bunny at the Olympics. It was more like Saturday Night Live with fur and feathers. The timing couldn't have been worse. In 1980, the U.S. boycotted the Moscow Olympics, which meant NBC dropped its planned tie-in. The film was hacked apart, shown sporadically on cable, and eventually shelved. Many of the edgier sequences from the 1979 work print were never broadcast. To parents of the time, it was a baffling near miss, a cartoon that seemed designed for kids but winked constantly at adults. Today, Animal Olympics is remembered mostly by cult fans who tracked down the missing footage. But for 70s parents, it was another reminder that animation could zig where they expected it to zag. A kids' cartoon that turned into social satire, then disappeared almost as fast as it arrived. The Missing Adventures of Uncle Croc, 1970. By the mid-70s, Saturday morning television was running wild with experiments. None were stranger than Uncle Croc's Block, a live-action and animation mashup hosted by Charles Nelson Riley as a bitter crocodile MC. Buried inside the chaotic variety show were animated shorts, parodies of superheroes, fairy tales, and more. Parents expected light comedy. Instead, they got a cynical, biting mockery of the very cartoons their kids usually watched. The shorts were cheaply made but loaded with odd humor. Heroes were cowardly, villains were incompetent, and moral lessons were flipped upside down. Kids sat there bewildered, and parents often hated it even more. The mix of live-action grumpiness and animated chaos made the whole block feel less like fun and more like a parody of fun. The backlash was immediate. Ratings tanked, parents complained, executives panicked. The show was canceled within a year, and the animated segments were quietly shelved. Unlike other cartoons that found second lives in reruns, Uncle Croc's cartoons simply vanished. Vaulted, destroyed, or left to rot, they became some of the most lost animation of the decade. For parents, the shock wasn't just that the shorts existed, but that they mocked the very idea of cartoons being uplifting. At a time when families wanted escapism, Uncle Croc's world offered sarcasm and disillusionment. No wonder parents never forgave it, and no wonder the cartoons disappeared. So there you have it, 13 lost animated films from the 1970s that parents never saw coming. From cockroach poets to psychedelic myths, from grim toy stories to Olympic satire, these weren't your standard Saturday morning safe bets. They were messy, bold, and unforgettable in all the wrong ways. Which of these surprises do you wish you could track down today? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more dives into animation's strangest corners.